Okay, let's continue where we left off in the previous video. As you remember, we finished the installation of the ESXi server, and in the end we were given information that we use to access the ESXi server through the web browser. So let me log in quickly to the newly installed ESXi server so that you can see the management interface. Okay, after login, you can see basic information of your ESXi server. You can see the version which is installed, you can see the uptime, and on your right you can see basic hardware resources that are available to the server. If you scroll a little below, you can see additional information of the hardware that you are using. As I mentioned previously, I'm using consumer grade hardware, and you can see my motherboard model here. Also below the motherboard you can see information about my CPU and a given memory. Since this is a clean ESXi server that was recently installed, we need to go through all the tabs on the left and configure each one so that we can use the ESXi server. Currently it has no virtual machines, storage is not configured, and also networking is left at default. We will be going through one tab at a time and going into a little more detail so that you can configure your first ESXi server. Let's start with storage. As I mentioned previously, other than my NVMe drive, which is used for the ESXi server installation, I have one SSD drive and one HDD drive available for usage with new data stores. Let me now show you how to create a new data store. We will be creating a new VMFS data store. And I will be using my SSD drive as my first SSD store. I will be using the full disk with the VMFS 6 file system. After a few seconds, the newly created data store is shown. I will be creating another data store. It will also be a new data store, and it will be located on my HDD drive. I will be naming it HDD store. I will also be using the full disk with the VMFS 6 file system. After a few seconds, newly created data store is shown. As you can see here, now I have my initial data store on my NVMe drive and two newly created data stores for use. Usually I use the SSD store for locating my operating system disks for my virtual machines, and all the data and data disks are located on the HDD store, where speed is not important. If you want to know a little more, you can check out the Devices tab. Here you can see all the drives connected to your ESXi server. Also, you can see your storage controllers. If you want to quickly check what is located in the data store, you can go through Data Store browser. Since this is a clean installation of the ESXi server, all the data stores are currently empty. That is pretty much it for the storage page. Next, we will go through the networking settings. Let's proceed with configuration of network. As you can see here, during the installation of the ESXi server, some virtual switches and port groups have already been created so that we can connect to the web browser. Under the physical NICs, you can see all the available network adapters. And also, under the Virtual Switches tab, you can see so far created virtual switches that are being used for the port groups. As I said previously, all of this was done during the installation. We will now be creating a few virtual switches that will be used for our custom port groups. I will be creating a virtual switch for my IoT network first. Then I will be creating a virtual switch for my DMZ network. As you can see here, only available network adapters are shown in the drop-down menu. After we create virtual switches, we can then create port groups that are using them. I will be creating my IoT port group and assign a virtual switch I created in previous step. As you can see here, I could be using VLAN IDs if I had multiple networks on my port. But I already did the segregation on my Cisco switch, and currently I'm not using VLAN IDs. Now let's create a port group for my DMZ network. I'm also not using VLAN IDs for my DMZ since all the segregation of network traffic was configured previously on my Cisco switch, and I'm using dedicated ports. So here it is. We have created some new virtual switches and assigned port groups to each of them. We can now use those port groups when we create virtual machines to control the network traffic among them. Here are the networking options. We created some virtual switches and port groups that will be used by our virtual machines. Also, we created some data stores on the storage configuration page. We created two new data stores, SSD store and HDD stores. After all of that is complete, we can now proceed to create our new virtual machines. Click on the Create or Register Virtual Machine button. In our case, we will be creating a new virtual machine. Enter a name for the virtual machine and select the operating system details. We will be selecting Microsoft Windows and the version will be Microsoft Windows 10. If you want to use Secure Boot or enable IOMMU for your virtual machine, you can select this option. In our case, we won't be needing it. As I mentioned previously, I usually create my first disks, my operating system disks on the SSD. So I will be selecting my SSD store from the drop-down menu. Here you can adjust the hardware resources of your virtual machine. You can assign a number of CPU cores, dedicated memory, and also increase the size of your disk. You can also assign a network zone for your virtual machine. In the previous videos, we created a few port groups. We created an IoT port group or my DMZ port group. If I want to segregate my virtual machine's network access, I can assign a zone and separate them through it. I will be leaving my DMZ as a port group and a network adapter zone. In the end, click Finish to create the virtual machine. After we have completed the creation of our virtual machine and assigned some hardware resources to be available for the virtual machine, we now need to proceed to installation of the operating system. Let me just show you what is necessary to do next. When we click on our newly created virtual machine and go to the Edit option, we now need to insert or virtually mount an ISO image file that contains our operating system installation files. Since this is the clean installation of the ESXi server, currently I have no ISO files in my data stores. Allow me a minute or two to transfer an ISO file into my data store so that we can proceed with the installation of the operating system for our virtual machine. Transfer of the ISO file is now complete. Let me show you what I had to enable to achieve that. Position yourself to the host settings. From the Actions menu, select Enable SSH. When enabled, it will show a warning. After that is enabled, all you need to do is connect to the ESXi server through the WinSCP or other client and copy the ISO file to the data store. Let me show you where I copied my ISO file. I created a folder on my internal data store and called it ISOs. Here I transferred the ISO file, which is now available for my virtual machine creation and installation. Now we can go to our virtual machine where we will mount this ISO file as a local DVD drive for installation of the operating system. Click on your virtual machine and go to the Edit options. Under the DVD drive, select Data Store ISO file. I will be selecting my ISO file for Windows 10 installation. In the end, save the configuration. Okay, now we are ready to start our virtual machine and proceed with the operating system installation. I will now power on my virtual machine so that I can proceed with the operating system installation. I will also be opening my virtual machine's window as if I'm sitting right at my PC and doing the installation of operating system. From here on, the procedure of the installation of operating system is practically the same as if you would be doing that on your laptop or your PC. Operating system version is not important to us since we are doing this as a test for the virtual machine creation. I will be going with the default options until the end of the installation. Since I'm installing this virtual machine on my SSD drive, it should complete pretty fast. Okay, and the initial file copy process is now complete and Windows are being installed. As you can see here, the virtual machine acts as a real computer. It even has its own BIOS. And also drivers used within the virtual machine are pretty much basic drivers. Another reboot. And we are now in the finishing phase of the Windows 10 installation. Once again, I will leave all the options at default settings. Up until this point, it basically took somewhere between 4 to 5 minutes for the Windows installation. So, since I won't be using my Microsoft Online account, I had to do some steps to switch to the local user store. I will leave all of these options at default. Okay, not that bad. Under the total of 10 minutes, we now have a fully functional virtual machine acting as another PC on our network. Okay, it's time to sum up all the steps we went through this video. At first, we installed our ESXi server and basically configured all the necessary options that we need to use so that we can proceed with virtual machine creation. We created some data stores for storage of virtual machine disks, and also we configured networking options. If you remember, we created some virtual switches and port groups to segregate our network traffic. All of this had to be done so that we can install our first virtual machine on this ESXi server. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving a thumbs up.